In the last video, we set up a very simple firearm that allows for the player to not only pick it up like we did in the video before, but that we can actually interact with, so that way we can fire different projectiles or perform a hit scan so we can apply damage eventually to our enemies. Now, in the last video, we didn't get that set up, but in this video, we're going to actually work on adding damage to the whatever it is that we hit, and we're also going to take this opportunity to start building on our first AI. We're not going to build in all the logic for our AI to be able to move around yet, but we want to make sure that we're actually able to hit this AI and that we're able to damage it, so we know that we have something at least working with our AI. Before we jump into the video, if you want to help support the channel, you might notice I'm wearing a VR Playground shirt. I have that as well as a VR Playground hat available at vrpstudios.com/store. You don't have to, but it's a great way to help support the channel, so that way I can continue to make videos just like this one. And I will have a link to that down below as well. With that, let's go and jump right into the video. Now, before we get too far into things, first thing I want to show you is I did make a couple quick modifications just for testing these firearms. The first thing that I did end up changing is I disabled gravity on this firearm here. This is really just meant so that way we have a nice stationary weapon that we can fire. And I'm going to add in a custom event here, and we're going to make this a call-in editor event. What this will allow for us to do is, rather than having to throw on the headset and test it every time we want to test the firing mechanism on here, we can simply hit this button in the editor. It'll show up in the details panel when we click on it, and it'll allow for us to fire a projectile just as we would in VR. This just makes things a little bit simpler to test. We don't have to throw on and off the headset or anything like that. We can just jump in the editor, hit this button, and we know that our projectiles are going to fire it, and we can test it nice and simple this way. Now that we have this done on our firearm, let's go and jump into the projectile. And there's going to be a couple things that we're going to want to do here. The first thing we're going to want to do is modify the collision settings for this projectile. So I'm going to set this to custom, make sure it's set to world dynamic. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to the bottom and I'm going to set the physics body to ignore. I'll show you why we are going to be doing this once we end up in our AI pawn, but that's just going to allow for us to overlap with everything. And then we can go ahead and run our on component overlap for this sphere. Now, once we end up actually overlapping with something, it's very simple. All we're going to do is we're going to apply a damage, and then I like to make the base damage a variable that is exposed on spawn and instance editable. This will allow for us to modify this damage in the projectile itself, and that's really all that we need to do for the projectile itself. The other thing that we're also going to do, though, is we are going to destroy the actor. This just kind of keeps it from stacking on top of itself like we were originally experiencing here. You can now see it despawns just as you would expect. Now, jumping back again over here into our firearm, there's going to be a couple things again we're going to want to do over here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to come down here to where we were doing the hit scan, the line trace, and we're going to add a couple things onto the end of this branch here. So we're going to simply apply damage, and it's going to be the same thing. We're going to pass through the hit actor, and then again we're going to make the base damage a variable that we can modify in the weapon itself. And same thing, I'm going to make this public. I'm not going to bother making it exposed on spawn. We don't need that here. But if we come right back on up to our projectile, you should be able to see that there is an option here for the base damage. Now, if you don't see this, right click on this node. There should be a refresh nodes, and you will see that variable pop up when you spawn in this projectile. So it'll be nice and simple and easy to use. Now that we have our firearms completely set up, now let's go ahead and start setting up our NPC. The NPC isn't going to do much like I had mentioned before. We're simply going to be using this to test the apply damage function and make sure that it's in fact working. So I'm going to go and create a new character blueprint class and spawn this in. We'll just keep it nice and simple, just base underscore enemy. And then once we have this in here, we don't really need to do too much here. I'm going to go and spawn in a mesh, which I believe I might have one somewhere in here. We'll go and use this nice, simple little dummy mesh. I'm going to go and bring this down and rotate it. You do want to make sure that it is facing the same rotation as this arrow that comes as part of the character. It'll just make it a little easier to do movement later, so you can clearly make sure that the enemy is actually moving in the correct direction. And then we just need to come down here, and I want to make sure of a couple things. First things first, we're going to go ahead and modify the collision presets a little bit and just make sure that it is in fact a pawn here, which you can in fact see that it is. And then on our capsule component, I'm going to modify this one here, but I want to make this one a physics body. This goes back to our projectile. We want to make sure that this is a physics body, so we're making sure we're hitting the skeletal mesh and not just an invisible capsule around the mesh. This can just make that collision a little bit more accurate and just make it a little bit easier to actually, hit the correct thing and not just hit a general area around. You don't necessarily have to do this, but it is just a little bit easier. Now coming around here to the event graph, there's again going to be a couple things we're going to do. First off, I'm going to disable tick because we don't need that. And we should find an on damage event or any damage event. And this any damage event will trigger whenever we run that apply damage function in our projectile or on the hit scan. So just to do a quick test, I'm just going to make sure that this is in fact working. We're just going to do an append into a print string, and we're just going to make sure that we are in fact dealing damage to our enemy. Now, while I'm placing down these enemies, a couple quick little things. You can see right now I'm trying to make sure that it's lined up correctly with these firearms. Obviously, this is a necessary step. You want to make sure that when you're firing off these firearms, it is in fact going to work. Obviously, if it doesn't, that's going to be a whole different issue we're going to have to deal with later. As you can see though, there is an issue with the collision where the projectiles aren't quite hitting the enemy. It just kind of seems to be flying through it. Now, this is a pretty simple fix. At the time when I was recording this, I did kind of screw this up just a little bit. There's actually two things that you're going to want to do. I'm not doing the first one just yet, even though it's probably the more apparent of the two. You want to be generating those overlap events. There's a little checkbox right above the collision settings where you're going to want to make sure that that is set in order to make sure that the projectiles are in fact generating that overlap event with the pawn itself, or the character rather. The other thing, of course, you might want to also change the collision preset as well. I found that changing it to preset seems to work pretty well myself. Now, you might not have noticed, we've jumped forward a little bit here. The collision wasn't quite actually running the apply damage, and this ended up being quite a simple fix. The base damage actually does need to be set to some value. This was a small little mistake that I had made when I had actually set up our projectiles and our firearm. In the firearm itself, I never set that base damage to an actual value. It remained at 0, and so you just kind of want to go in and make sure that that base damage is set to some value. It doesn't need to be a large value, but if it is set to 0, the applied damage will not run whatsoever, so just make sure of that. I'm just removing some of the things that I had here for testing, trying to figure out what was going on because I was having a bit of difficulty with that. But now that we have the base damage set, you should see there in the top left that we are in fact receiving that damage on the actual character itself. So now that we have our damage actually being received on the enemy itself, we're going to go ahead and actually do something with this. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create two variables. One is going to be called max health, and one is just going to be called current health. I will be setting max health to public. You would assume on most enemies that they kind of start out with a maximum health value. And the reason I kind of split this into two is because when we do this, what it'll allow for us to do is if we ever want to regenerate health on the enemy, we know the limit as to how much health this enemy can have. And then with this, I like to go into the construction script and just set our current health equal to whatever the max health is, because we expect for it to normally spawn with the max health that we give it. Now that we have this in place, dealing with the health is fortunately rather simple from here. All we're going to take is we're going to make sure our current health is always equal to the current health minus whatever the damage we receive is. This will allow for us to obviously decrease that health over time. It'll make things nice and clean and simple. And then after we apply this current health, we're going to want to see if it's less than or equal to 0, because this means that this enemy should of course be dead. And then of course, if this enemy should be dead, we're simply going to destroy it. We're not going to do anything too out of the ordinary with this enemy here. Now, if we want to do anything additional after this enemy has died, event destroyed is typically a good way of doing this. I'm just going to do something nice and simple where we're just going to spawn a Niagara effect. Something that should be noted with this, if you run any sort of delays or anything after the event destroyed, those will not function. Anything that happens after destroyed has to be done in one shot. So if you need something delayed, my typical recommendation is to do something like spawn in an additional actor that's going to do that delay for you, and then just kind of have it stick around for a short period of time, however long you need it, before you go ahead and run that destroyed event. And now what we should see is if we go ahead and run our fire on this projectile, after 3 shots, that enemy is going to destroy, and you might be able to see there is a small little Niagara effect that does spawn on that enemy. And with that, we now have a very simple setup so that way we're able to now apply damage to our enemies, and we can expand on our enemy that we've created so that way we can actually interact with this enemy and he can interact with us, chase us down, attack us later on. We'll start working on that in the next video. With that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next reality.